Welcome back to Wartime Cafe. I'm your host, Laith Marouf, and you're watching Free Palestine TV. Before we continue with this episode, I ask you to press the subscribe button on whatever social media platform you're watching this on, and to go to our website, freepalestine.video, to donate so we can continue bringing you this content. Today, we have the youngest guest on Wartime Cafe since we started this show. We have with us Calla Walsh. Welcome to Beirut, to Lebanon. Thank you for being with us. Calla is a activist, communist, organizer from the United States who's now in Lebanon. Thank you again for being here, Calla.
Thank you for having me. I didn't realize I carried the honor of being the youngest guest.
Yes, I think you're the first Gen Z, as some of the crew have pointed out to be our guest, and this is a clear indicator of the kind of work that you've done that deserves you to sit here on the seat in the Wartime Cafe. Many of the people may have known you from social media, specifically about the incident of you being arrested because of your activism after the beginning of al-Aqsa flood, targeting war manufacturers, weapons manufacturers in the US that are associated with the genocide that's happening in Gaza. But before we get to that, let's give our audience a good background about you. You're born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and that's in the northeast of the US, pretty close to Canada. And you come from a family, your dad is a professor, English.
That's right.
And how did you go from being, born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, part of the, professor family, English literature? What drove you to start your activism as young as 15 years old in 2019, part of the organizing of the Boston Youth Climate Strike?
Yes, feels like a long time ago. First of all, I like to think it's in my blood, being Irish, although my ancestors came over a century ago. The blood of resistance against imperialism and colonialism. I first got involved at 15, both with more community organizing and street protest, and at the same time doing a lot of electoral organizing within the Democratic Party. It was a very active time, the first Trump administration. The first moments I was really politicized around were like these kind of youth movements, March for Our Lives, Youth Climate Strike, which looking back we see are very liberal and were co-opted and neutralized in a lot of ways by the Democratic Party, but a lot of radicals and people in the Palestine movement now have come out of those movements. But at the same time, I was being funneled into this Democratic Party machine, and I think a lot of young people, when they want to get active in the United States, that is what is presented to them. And so at the same time as I was like a staff and volunteer on electoral campaigns, I was also participating in these movements in the streets. I was in the streets in 2020. I would say that is probably the most radicalizing moment of my life before the al-Aqsa flood.
So there was Corona, there was also the first Trump administration,
yes,
and the Black Lives Matter demonstrations happening at the same time. Do you feel that looking, because you mentioned electoral politics, you were involved in the Elizabeth Warren presidential campaign in 2020. How do you compare that with also, I see a list of other electoral politics campaigns that you were involved in, the Ed Markey Senate campaign, the Boston City Mayor campaign. You were the youngest delegate at the Democratic Socialist of America, DSA conference in 2021, and you decided to quit in 2021. So this experience of being in the electoral politics machine, what sort of some of these things that happened to you during this that convinced you that there's no path for change within electoral politics?
Yeah, I totally had a career path within the Democratic Party, and for a while I thought I would end up being a chief of staff or campaign manager on some of these campaigns, but I was always guided by my political principles and not just careerism, and I think I saw ultimately that these tactics were futile. And I think a lot of people look at my journey of radicalization and how many different groups I've moved through, different tactics I've attempted, and maybe use that to delegitimize me. But none of the tactics that I condemn are not ones that I've tried myself and seen not working. I'd say the major turning point was May 2021 with the siege and assault on Gaza and the resistance fiercely striking back. That was the first time in my life that I really had to confront, the issue of Palestine and of Palestinian national liberation and U.S. imperialism. And I'd been part of the Ed Markey campaign. I'd been on payroll by the Massachusetts Democratic Party during the 2020 general election. I was working on helping run his social media accounts. And that was a major turning point where I kind of looked at everything I'd done in the past and realized that I had been part of this party that fully supports a genocide. And because we'd been so focused on things like the Green New Deal and free public transportation and free healthcare and making lives better for US citizens, rather than looking at the entire world and how making life better for US citizens and redistributing the wealth that we've looted from the global south is social imperialism, is not actually how we're going to liberate ourselves. And so I publicly split with the Democratic Party. I felt like it was very important to make a public turn and to use the pressure we had, having worked for his campaign, having been very close to his staff, including his Senate staff, to try to build pressure on him to change his position. Obviously, that did not work.
Ed Markey,
yes, yeah. Who's running for his next term. He's going to be 90 by the end of his next term. He's up for re-election in 2026. But even the pressure that we had, being people who were very close to him, his campaign, he knew us personally, it was futile because he takes AIPAC money, and even if he didn't take AIPAC money, he works for the US imperialist government that is built off of genocide and constant warfare and settler colonial expansionism. And so at that moment, I really decided to shift back from electoral politics altogether. And ideologically, I'd already been making this shift since 2020 and began just fully studying communism, anti-imperialism, and also centering my work in that. And I felt like it was important too to publicly self-criticize and account for this shift, to spread that message to other young people and to really look at things like direct action, community organizing, internationalism as more effective ways to make change than lobbying or voting. So yeah, that's kind of where I ended up. But I would also say after that shift, with entering more anti-imperialist spaces, I was still working in NGOs, all these above ground organizations, and the al-Aqsa flood triggered another kind of shift and split in that way, where I understood a lot of that work to be more liberal and reformist and not conducive to the goals of revolution.
So you criticized Markey during the attack on Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem. You published an article in the Mundo Wise at the time. Explain to us what were your expectations from this public criticism? And we saw a lot of people, of course, that were inside the Democratic Party getting angry at your position. What were your justifications then? And looking back, does it even matter? This pressure, would it have actually changed a position of somebody who's a declared Zionist?
I don't think it would have ever changed his position. I think it was an important effort to make, rather to demonstrate to the thousands of people who put their money, their volunteer hours, their labor into that campaign, that he still doesn't work for us. And I mean, the way that campaign happened, a young Kennedy was running against him in Massachusetts. Markey was losing in all the polls. Everyone thought Kennedy was going to win, but Markey had, slightly better, more radical politics. He was endorsed by AOC. He was the co-author of the Green New Deal in the Senate. And so we really pushed hard for him, mostly young people who'd been in the Warren and Bernie campaigns. And that was the reason he won. Like, it was because of the free labor that young people did on his campaign, especially on social media, especially digital organizing during the pandemic when everything shifted online. And he credited us in his victory speeches, the Markey verse, for that victory. And so really it was to demonstrate that he does not work for us. He does not work for the people. He works for his donors. He works for the empire. He works for the weapons companies, as is the case for every US politician, even the ones who have better rhetoric. And so publishing that, I think, was more to speak to fellow young people, fellow people in the movement who'd been on the campaign or been part of that movement in general, to show that you don't have to be caught in this path, that you can actually develop politically and take a different shift, and to encourage more people to do that. And I certainly wouldn't credit myself for that, but I do think we've seen that shift happen en masse because of Palestine. Which, even if the genocide hadn't escalated after the al-Aqsa flood, this still should have happened, because Palestine is the key to understanding US-led imperialism in every corner of the world. And what has happened in Palestine, first the US did to establish itself on stolen land.
You did end up in Montreal at McGill University, and I lived in Montreal for 25 years and worked on those campuses on the issue of Palestine at McGill and other universities. When you compare that student activism that you were doing in the northeast of the US to that in Quebec for that short period that you were in Montreal, how would you compare the two milieus?
That's a really good question, and I'm definitely not the best person to speak on it just because I spent less than a year there, but I do think it's a little bit more radical, in Quebec specifically. I mean, Quebec always has bigger protest turnout than anywhere else in Canada, and there's the history of the riots, if you'll accept that term, that you were part of.
No, it's an uprising, it's not a riot.
Uprising, riot. I say riot in a very positive light. And the student strikes, against tuition hikes, have wielded actual power in ways that the student movement in the US sadly hasn't really since the 70s, the 80s, in terms of actually affecting change, which is not to diminish the student intifada in the US at all, but I think so long as it's appealing to the universities to make change, rather than to dismantle these settler colonial universities and to bring the struggle into the streets, then it is going to be futile. But yeah, I have a lot of love for people in Montreal, people doing work there. I think there's a lot of contradictions, of course, since it's also a settler colonial state, and land needs to be given back there. And so long as also our activism in the so-called US and so-called Canada does not center the question of settler colonialism, imperialism in those locations, we won't be able to effectively struggle for Palestine if we're not applying our analysis of Palestine to our own conditions in the West and in these settler states.
So in a way, you had the same kind of trajectory as Greta Thunberg, going
people have called me the masshole Greta Thunberg.
But you got to be more radical, it seems, at least with the Palestine Action stuff. So you went through the electoral politics, and then you decided to begin working with the national network on Cuba before we talk about Palestine, which is very important right now. The situation in both Cuba and the whole Caribbean and Venezuela is very on the edge. And you went on a delegation to Cuba, solidarity delegation. Explain to us, as an American, what does Cuba and the struggle for Cuba mean to you, and why it should be a priority for any American? And how do you see this networking with the people in Cuba affects your understanding of the situation inside the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think traveling to sanctioned countries, whether it's Cuba, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Iran, that is a direct action in itself in defiance of US imperialist sanctions. And I think getting to travel to the global south, to an anti-imperialist nation under the siege of US empire at such a young age was really radicalizing for me. I mean, the situation in Cuba is awful. Like the blockade, its effects are genocidal. Its intent is genocidal. Its intent is to cause mass starvation, which it has not achieved because Cuba's first priority is to care for its people. But the revolution persists. It still persists despite being under the most prolonged and severe economic sanctions in the world. And people in the US have done these solidarity delegations for decades and decades. And they used to have to fly to Canada or to Czechoslovakia in order to get to Cuba. Now there's direct flights from the US, and it's actually easier to travel there than a lot of people think. I mean, tourism is technically illegal, but you can go on a support for the Cuban people travel certificate and effectively, do tourism and meet with the people there. And I mean, I highly recommend anyone there or anyone in the US to do that, to bring material aid, to learn from the Cuban Revolution. And I think Cuba's example is so important, not only of defiance of US imperialism, but of material armed support to other anti-colonial, anti-imperialist liberation struggles around the world. And of course, Cuba today is not in the same position to, send troops to, like Africa, how they did in Angola and other countries to fight apartheid invasions. But they are still providing really important support to Palestine in other ways. Many of my comrades there are Palestinians training to be doctors, and Cuba does everything it can, despite these sanctions, despite this siege. But I think there's a lot of fear-mongering. I mean, less so with Cuba because it's become more normalized to travel there since it's so close to the US, but fear-mongering around traveling to sanctioned countries, relating to sanctioned entities out of fear that will bring down repression on us. And the reality is that the more of us that take up those actions, the harder it is to repress them. And even if travel to Cuba becomes illegal tomorrow, we still need to continue this work. We still need to continue building bridges of solidarity with them. But ultimately, as long as the Cuban Revolution persists, I think the blockade will persist. And so ultimately what is going to end the sanctions, what is going to alleviate the situation in Cuba is going to be other countries in the global south breaking the blockade, breaking the siege, which of course there already is to some extent, with trade with countries like Venezuela, Russia, China, etc. But it's not enough, and there needs to be more. And in the US, the most important thing we can do is to struggle against imperialism in our own country and to dismantle the empire from within. And that's what Che said himself, that he's jealous of us in North America because we're in the belly of the beast, and that is a really, really important role to have. So I engaged in a wide variety of tactics in the Cuba Solidarity work, including much lobbying. I mean, my first arrest actually was protesting in Bob Menendez's Senate office before he was indicted on federal charges and convicted. But, we were still really trying to apply pressure to the government to change its policy, to go back to the Obama era normalization. And of course, the situation in Cuba got a lot better when some of the sanctions were lifted under Obama, and there was a prisoner exchange. The Cuban Five were released and got to return after being incarcerated in the US for over a decade. But ultimately, that was still a tactic of regime change. And it's important to recognize it as that and not to romanticize the Obama era policy, because he recognized the blockade hadn't worked at overthrowing the revolution, and he thought that, opening Cuba up to more US trade, businesses would be more effective regime change strategy. And that is equally as dangerous.
Right now, there's a huge buildup of American military assets around Venezuela, and we don't know if there will be a war anytime soon. Do you feel that the radicalization that happened right now within the activist scene in the United States around Palestine would have an effect on having movement oppose the attack on Venezuela?
I do think everything since the al-Aqsa flood in itself, and everything since then, because the flood is not over, and the flood of the free and the flood of return is not over. It has fundamentally shifted anti-imperialist consciousness in the US. And I pinpoint 2020 a lot as an example that gives me hope in revolutionary potential in the US, because that was a mass militant rebellion as much as the following counterinsurgency has tried to portray it as something else. But there wasn't that same kind of anti-imperialist consciousness present in that rebellion that there has been since the al-Aqsa flood, since anti-imperialist arms guerrilla struggle was put back on the table, and youth in the Imperial Corps began to identify with that guerrilla struggle and see it as the compass. But unfortunately, I don't think that is applicable to like the Palestine movement as a whole or the Palestine solidarity movement. I think there's still people who see Palestine as like a siloed single issue and a humanitarian issue, and they don't like see it as part of the world system of imperialism as a whole. And there is like a distinct difference between, you know, people who see our role as to also build a resistance versus people who see us as this kind of like detached solidarity movement. And we can also like pinpoint a lot of that in Oslo, in the development of terror lists in the US, parallel with Oslo, that severed people in the diaspora from being able to even relate to the armed resistance and like leadership of the Palestinian people, and the NGOization of Palestinian society and the NGOization of the movement in the West, which has become like the primary mechanism of counterinsurgency. A lot of the repression against us doesn't have to come directly from the state. It comes from within the movement, from these NGO structures. And so I do think there's a lot of people who, if they understand what's happening in Palestine, they understand what's happening in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Iran, in Venezuela, in Cuba. But I wouldn't say that's everyone. And I think that's something we need to keep pushing, that Palestine is not a single issue, that we need to, in order to liberate Palestine, in order to liberate the world from imperialism, we need to build a broader anti-imperialist movement and like universalize what we see in Palestine and apply it to our own conditions, if that makes sense.
To go back to Greta Thunberg and that trajectory of going from environmental issues to anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism. You know, myself, I've lived with Indigenous nations in Canada for years and spent a lot of time on their decolonization struggles. And for decades, I would see all these environmentalists come to these sites of extraction and talk about environmentalism, but not being able to click in their head how colonialism is the cause of this extraction that is happening, that's destroying the environment. Do you think, this, if you are genuine in your environmentalism, you will naturally understand these things? And did that actually help you get to dive into more the issues of colonialism and imperialism? Environmentalism, is it a good start for youth that are not radicalized yet?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything comes back to imperialism. And I think climate was like an issue that radicalized me because it made me feel like I didn't have a future. But it all comes back to imperialism and all the like single issue focused work I was doing, whether it was on climate, whether it was on housing, whether it was on like transportation in the US or social issues in the US. None of those can be addressed if we do not dismantle imperialism. Like, I'm a communist, of course, and I want to see like a communist world revolution. But the first question is dismantling imperialism. And of course, like, communist struggle and organizing is a mechanism to resist imperialism. But in order to like make the ultimate changes we want to see, we have to dismantle this world system of imperialism. And that necessitates a unity of the field, like a unity of different ideological tendencies in the immediate objectives of the revolution. And so, I mean, a lot of the climate work that's just single issue focused on like shutting down fossil fuels, on divestment, on green energy, like genuinely all of that is futile so long as the US military is the biggest polluter in the world. And I think anyone who takes the issue of climate seriously ultimately will recognize that. And that's why Greta Thunberg's trajectory should not be surprising. I mean, the only surprising thing about it is that she had every opportunity to sell out in the world. And like, certainly I disagree with things she's done, such as meeting with Zelensky. But like, she chose the path that was more difficult. She chose the path of standing with anti-imperialism, of standing with Palestine. And like, I mean, I tend to do that in very different ways than she does. And that's not to like equate myself to her at all. But I have a lot of respect for that because it isn't the easier path. And when you become like a young person in the movement, very visible, you're presented with every possible opportunity to sell out and become a careerist. And she didn't choose that, and so I respect that.
Yeah, definitely. She was kind of paraded by many of the leaders of Western countries, including Trudeau, the former Prime Minister of Canada.
Who didn't say shit when she was beaten and detained
None
by the
of
IOF,
them.
of course.
Yeah, yeah. And yes, and of course, whatever criticism we may have for some of her positions, like you said, with Ukraine, that does not stop us from showing solidarity with her because of the torture and mistreatment at the hands of the Israeli occupation. And definitely people who are older should have some patience with our younger generation. I'm fine with hearing people from her generation taking public criticism. I do have I personally, with all my criticism that I agree with you on, I wouldn't take a public position criticizing her because of that age. I think it's fine for the youth like you to discover these things and through their experience come to the conclusions that you came. I know you were noting how people were looking at your involvement over your young age, being in different movements, so many of them, and thinking that this is a problematic thing. It actually is a great thing. It shows that you've learned and was learning fast. And from that point here, we see that you began working with, after you stepped out of all of this electoral politics stuff, with the Boston Mapping Project, which I was looking at their maps at the time and so on. I don't know what happened to them since then. Explain what's the Boston Mapping Project and how did it ruin the nights of the Zionists in Massachusetts?
Yeah, this is actually a little Zionist propaganda that I have to debunk because I genuinely had nothing to do with the mapping project, nothing. And I would never want to take credit for those anonymous people's work, which is incredible. Everyone should look at that website. Every state should have a mapping project. For people who don't know, it maps all the institutional connections between Zionism, imperialism, policing, whether it's in universities, museums, businesses, prisons, etc. And so this was an anonymous project. It was launched in June 2022, right when I was graduating high school. And I was, affiliated with local organizing around Palestine in Boston. And some local groups stood up for the mapping project and uplifted it when it was launched. I was kind of naive in that I didn't think it would be controversial at all, at least among the Palestine movement, but it generated the most insane backlash, not only from politicians and the Zionists, that's expected, but from within the Palestine movement. And this is really when I became aware early on of the contradictions that exist within the Palestine Solidarity movement, because the group that helped promote the project, BDS Boston, was condemned by the BDS National Committee, which still has on their website a disclaimer that BDS Boston is not affiliated with them. Basically, they bought into the Zionist narrative that this was some hit list of Jewish targets, which the Zionists have also said themselves that none of these targets have ever been really targeted. No harm has ever been done against people there. But it was dangerous because it was providing a map for direct action and for institutional targeting and boycotting and more than that. And so that was the first time I really got insanely doxxed by Zionists. I was working at a frozen yogurt shop and they harassed and spammed my boss who didn't really care, and he just gave me a week of paid time off, which is really nice. But that's how I ended up on Canary Mission for the first time. But I think since the al-Aqsa flood, we've seen a proliferation of kind of similar projects mapping militarism, mapping weapon shipments nationwide, internationally. But what's effective about the mapping project is it also links to the local policing and settler colonial infrastructure that is the U.S. government, and shows all the links between it and Zionism. And I would also say, I know we're going to talk about PAL Action, but the the independence of the Palestine movement in Boston, it had always had very principled lines, around working with groups like PSL or DSA, around the BDS National Committee, around liberal Zionism, which is so present in a lot of the Palestine solidarity movement. And so I think that that whole experience had heightened the contradictions and developed the politics, laying the groundwork for an effective direct action campaign against Elbit to take place.
Yeah, I mean, BDS National Committee also has a disclaimer about BDS Quebec, and definitely they are very much controlling, although BDS should be a local thing and the local organizers know better the issues in their country. And you're right about how NGOized it is. The BDS movement as a whole. There's a few other parts of the Palestinian issue in the diaspora that are very NGOized like that. When we compare the direct action of a group like Palestine Action, which you ended up joining in the US, to the BDS, we see that one cannot happen without the other. BDS will never be successful if the Palestinians are not resisting on the ground and showing the rest of the world that they're still existing and still resisting, which motivates people to actually support BDS. So Palestine Action, there's a lot of talk about them right now with the banning in the UK, prescription as a terrorist organization. How did you decide to start Palestine Action in the US, and what happened since then? Because it morphed into a group called Unity of Fields. Explain to us that.
Yeah, so it was the al-Aqsa flood that triggered us to start Palestine Action in the US. We started planning the first direct action at an Elbit Systems facility that very day on October 7th. We woke up and we saw Palestinians re-entering their homelands, taking their land back, staging the most beautiful armed struggle. It shattered history, and it put resistance back on the table in a way that we hadn't been confronted with, and nothing has ever been the same since. And I think those of us who'd been involved in Palestine organizing for a couple of years or longer before then, we immediately understood that this moment would be co-opted and neutralized and watered down, and that it would be pivoted away from the goal of resistance. And so we felt like immediate escalation was necessary in tandem with the Palestinian resistance. And I would say the way it played out it's very insightful into the different legal criminal regimes that exist in the US and the UK and other countries. We were active for about 6 weeks. We did direct actions at the Cambridge, Massachusetts office, which is a half mile from where I grew up my whole life, and also in New Hampshire, of course. And there were direct actions at several other Elbit facilities and subsidiaries along the eastern seaboard in the US. But the Cambridge facility is the only one that was permanently closed down.
In the UK, the courts almost always found no fault in what the activists were doing in Palestine Action, trying to stop the weapons being shipped to continue a genocide. How did that play out differently in the courts in the United States? And I mean, it is common law. So did the lawyers try to use the precedents of the cases in the UK in your cases, or not?
No. I mean, first I should have said, right away, we launched this campaign, of course, because it was already existing in the UK, and we saw how successful it had been, and we had that groundwork to build off of. They launched in July 2020 with their first direct actions, and they'd already permanently closed several Elbit factories. And we were so inspired by that example and directly able to coordinate with people who had been doing these direct actions for years on a massive, massive scale. And as you said, for years, they were getting away with jury nullifications, with necessity defenses, arguing to the courts, we did this to stop a genocide, to stop war crimes. And often the juries would agree with that, and people would get off with no charges. And the reason that changed is just because the UK government could not tolerate the efficacy of Palestine Action in the UK anymore. And so they had to resort to the most draconian measures of repression to shut them down. In the US, we have way more freedom of speech laws. We have a constitution, we have a First Amendment. There's no constitution in the UK. There's no such protections. People wave resistance flags at protests in the US, some protests in the US. There are also organizations who are too paranoid and legally conservative, and they think that waving a resistance flag will somehow get them terrorism charges, which is just ridiculous and not true at all. But in the UK, there are different laws around property damage. Property is a lot more sacrosanct in the US system, and also just the regime of repression. Police carry guns in the US. Police don't usually carry guns in the UK. That's a big difference. And so we immediately got hit with charges. I got 3 felony charges and 1 misdemeanor charge in Cambridge before the New Hampshire action took place. I was banned from that facility. I was banned from a whole 100-yard radius in my neighborhood that I had to avoid. And so we stopped doing actions there, and we focused on this New Hampshire facility in Merrimack, New Hampshire, which is a purple state Republican governor. And unlike the Cambridge facility, which was just an office where people were doing computer work, this New Hampshire factory, they were producing weapons parts. They were producing screens that are used on weapon systems. Lots and lots of employees working there, engineering, producing parts every day. And we felt that was, really important to strike. And the goals of direct actions, there's always multiple goals. You want to have maximum material impact and damage to their ability to produce and ship weapons. You also want to achieve a propaganda effect. And that's also why I don't discard the usefulness of mass marches altogether. I think mass mobilization is really important, and it's a piece of propaganda, and it shows our solidarity. And there's a difference between mass marches that are resistance and mass marches that are parades. So anyways, we were trying to balance all of those different goals. And ultimately, we were trying to experiment with this strategy in the US and apply it to our conditions. And I think that was really important to do. Although looking back, of course, I have lots of self-critiques and mistakes that I feel we made. I would never intentionally get arrested again. I think that is fundamentally pacifist. And if we're trying to inflict material damage, we need to do it in a clandestine, sustainable way. But so anyways, the New Hampshire action, it was kind of a tri-pronged, the state called it a riot and siege on Elbit, which I think is a funny way to put it. But 3 of us occupied the rooftop and caused material damage up there. We smashed the windows, did spray paint. We damaged a lot of HVAC systems, but we only had hammers and spray paint. So it wasn't we could inflict more material damage than what we had with that. At the same time, people blockaded the driveway to prevent employees from entering, and people also besieged the front of the building and smashed the front doors, sprayed the whole front of the building with red paint, threw mason jars filled with red paint that broke some of the windows, and those people all got away. One of them, my co-defendant Paige, was arrested later, 2 months later, through surveillance footage that they identified her through, but the rest of the people never were caught or identified. Only 4 of us were ever charged for this action, but it was a level of repression that we frankly had not really been prepared for. We didn't even know that New Hampshire had cash-only bail. Mm-hmm. And so suddenly we were locked up, being held on preventative detention. The state was trying to hold us without bail and just keep us locked up until trial. So we were locked up for 3 initial days. We were arraigned the next day, spent 2 nights in jail. We were arraigned, and they argued, that we were these anti-Semitic hooligans running around the US committing crimes in different states, and that we were flight risks and we needed to be held without detention. The judge disagreed and gave us $20,000 bail. 2 of us $20,000 bail since we'd already gotten arrested in Cambridge and been out on bail there, and then 1 person got $5,000 bail. And then we were released, bailed out the next day. But we were facing 6 felony charges, burglary, riot, sabotage, criminal mischief, criminal trespass, conspiracy to falsify physical evidence, a lot of crazy charges. And this is what the state does. They throw on a bunch of charges that they don't know will stick or not. For example, one of our charges had a mandatory 1-year minimum sentence. And they had to drop that charge later on because like in the statute, it wasn't even applicable to us at the time because it could only be applied during a state of emergency, which there wasn't declared in New Hampshire at the time. But they totaled to 37 years in prison. And we were also all given no contact orders, making it illegal for us to be in touch with each other. And so this kind of disorganized like our entire organization. It instilled a lot of fear and like had a chilling effect in the entire movement. We were incredibly isolated. People were too scared to talk to us. We couldn't talk to each other. People went into exile after this action, fled the country. And then we spent like a year awaiting our fate. Like half a year later, the no contact order got dropped, which was good because then we could talk to each other. But after that, PAL Action US effectively ceased to exist and be active in terms of like planning and coordinating actions. And again, like this was an important lesson, an experiment to attempt and to like extrapolate the lessons from, because I think the big thing is like we need degrees of separation between above ground and underground action. The way we were doing a lot of like public recruitment and training and operating as very visible spokespeople while also engaging direct action was not conducive to like a sustained campaign. We needed to be building structures that could withstand repression and withstand capture from the state, which is not to say we all need to be anonymous and that there isn't utility in having public spokespeople and faces attached to this. Like Huda and Richard from PAL Action UK, they are amazing at this. But I think our lesson was that we need direct action to be more autonomous. And so after that, I kept running the PAL Action US accounts for a long time, especially like during the student intifada and all of the direct action that happened after that. But there was like this long time period where effectively no direct action was happening at all, like until the April 15th economic blockade and until like the student intifada. And we were the only people facing like really crazy felony charges in the movement until Casey Ghannam was arrested in June 2024. And I know we'll talk about Casey and their case later on, but we ended up just being an account that would like receive a lot of submissions of direct actions anonymously and propagate them, which I think is a really important thing to do and to uplift direct action. And then in August of last year, rebranded as Unity of Fields. And I'm not gonna get into discussing how that played out now.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But obviously Unity of Fields is referencing to what the Palestinians were asking for and how they are organizing. And Filfil, the cat, is here.
Yeah, it was kind of like a response to a lot of the issues we were seeing in the so-called Palestine solidarity movement, and that we felt like this framework of solidarity was very passive, and that we needed to expand just beyond even Palestine as the focus and to branch into like a broader anti-imperialist movement as a whole. And we also, the Unity of Fields concept was like taken from, that term was coined by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and it denotes like the unity on the military front lines between different Palestinian political factions, unity in resistance. And when we raise critiques of the movement in the West, of its passivity, of its liberalism, of its failures and shortcomings, we're constantly told we're being divisive, we're being disunifying, and that we just need to build unity to free Palestine. But like unity for what? Not unity for unity's sake, like that's just liberalism. We need to build unity and shared principles of resistance in the immediate objectives of the revolution. And so regardless of like your ideology, if you are united in resistance and in dismantling imperialism by any means necessary, like I see you as a part of that. But if you're gonna throw us under the bus to the state, you're obviously not a part of that unity.
So obviously there has been a lot of repression, and you mentioned already Casey Ghannam, but before that there was Elias Rodriguez. I pronounce it sometimes the Arabic way. Elias Rodriguez, who took action by liquidating 2 workers at the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. How do you see, the progression from environmentalism to social issues, electoral politics, then direct action and then actually militancy, armed militancy. Elias seems to have come out of the blue, taking action by himself. Doesn't seem like he's connected to any movements, at least otherwise the government would have been hunting those official movements. So do you feel Elias Rodriguez taking his action by himself was kind of a direct continuation of the fact that Palestine Action in the US was targeted in such ways?
Yeah, I mean, just for the chronology, so Casey was doing direct actions in June 2024, right after the student encampments. Elias's action was May 2025.
Okay.
But I do think, when people see you face 37 years in prison for something like throwing red paint at a building, like why would you stop at throwing red paint in a building? And I'm not at all saying like, oh, Elias did this because he was inspired by us, but basically I think like the failures of the capital O organizations and like the self-proclaimed movement leadership, it is no wonder why we see these like individual militant actions as the most escalated forms of resistance against Zionism and imperialism. And it's not just Elias, there's been other individuals who've been locked up for individual acts of resistance, like Casey, like Chakai McRae, like Mohammed Suleiman in Colorado, and like plenty of others that I'm not mentioning. And whenever this happens, we hear critiques of individualism and adventurism, and from organizations and people who say they want to see armed struggle, but like not in this individual way. And they always quote like Lenin's text on left-wing communism and like his passage about adventurism and terrorism, which was a text written in like 1920 when the Bolsheviks were consolidating state power. And it was about what the Communist Party members should do. It was not about what individuals outside of the party should do. And we're in the US in the 21st century in the most violent genocidal empire that has ever existed in the history of the world. And those critiques at like the individual nature of these actions should really be redirected inward to the movement, which has failed to create any sort of infrastructure that can sustain real material resistance against Zionism and imperialism that leads individuals who are fed up and who want to contribute to the struggle to do these actions on their own. Like we should be asking ourselves why there weren't 100 more Elias Rodriguez's, why there weren't 10 of us able to evacuate him and to take out more Zionist diplomats. And I think the response we saw from people in the region and in the axis of resistance countries shows the importance of his action. On Iranian TV, we hear newscasters saying that Yahya Sinwars are being born in the United States and that this was a martyrdom operation. Khalid Barakat wrote an amazing article contextualizing Elias's actions in the history of external operations in the Palestinian Revolution, and that the Zionists and imperialists have made the entire world a battlefield, and therefore we have to be behind enemy lines everywhere, and that resistance anywhere in this world is justified and necessary. And you don't have to go to Palestine to take part in resistance. If you live in the US, you can do it right there, and that's exactly what Elias did. Aaron Bushnell is often referenced as having made the utmost sacrifice, and of course he should be upheld as the martyr and revolutionary that he was. But at the same time, people often just fetishize what Aaron Bushnell did, which was self-immolation and was not going on the offensive, an act of armed resistance. And there is a very distinct, there's a difference between those two things. And why do people invoke Aaron Bushnell but are too scared to say Elias Rodriguez's name? Being in prison and becoming a political prisoner is not martyrdom. And it's very important to treat and talk about our political prisoners as the living, breathing political subjects and revolutionaries that they are. But it is also a negation of your own existence in a sense. It is the utmost sacrifice before martyrdom to give your life away to possible incarceration for the rest of your life. I mean, Elias is facing the death penalty. And so I think it's really important to uphold these revolutionaries. And to also speak to Casey's case. Casey was part of the UC Berkeley encampment, and which basically ended in like dismantling itself and making concessions to the university and winning nothing in return.
But before that, there was these Zionist hooligans that were allowed by the state.
UCLA.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm mixing all the UC campuses there. But in general, there was a lot of Zionists coming on the campus, and the state and the police letting them harass and use violence against the Palestine encampment. So continue. You were telling us, Casey, at UC Berkeley, the encampment.
Yeah. So after the encampment dismantled itself and neutralized itself at the hands of the university administration, Casey carried out a series of operations, of resistance actions, specifically targeting federal government buildings and police vehicles. Because Casey is an incredibly smart person with great politics, and they also understand the US as a settler colonial entity that needs to be dismantled, and the US police as a domestic occupying force of the internally colonized populations of the US, and therefore also as just a legitimate target as like a weapons company per se. And Casey termed this Operation Campus Flood. And they carried out the series of actions. In June of last year, they were raided by the feds. They were arrested and incarcerated ever since. And a lot of their communications, their letters, their phone calls from when they were inside leading up to their sentencing is what was used against them in their sentencing. Because the thing is, Casey never compromised on their politics. They never backed down from their support for the Palestinian resistance. And they were very open in their communiques released during the actions, but also in everything they said after when they were in jail, that this was directly inspired by the al-Aqsa flood and the Palestinian resistance, and that the US movement has frankly failed to build our own resistance, and that is our duty here by any means necessary. And Casey, on September 22nd or 23rd, finally was sentenced. They entered a plea deal in January, and then the state kept pushing back their sentencing date because they were filing all of these like recordings and letters that they'd been doing with other people in jail to use against them. The prosecutor was asking for less time than what the judge gave. The judge gave Casey 19 years with terrorism enhancement, and they're pushing for Casey to be put in communication monitored units, which are known as little Guantanamos, basically limiting Casey to like very, very few phone calls every week, very, very little communication with the outside world. They will likely be put in a rural, isolated federal facility, probably a facility that is like mostly Muslim Arab men because of the terrorism enhancements. And it will be very hard for their comrades and friends to visit them. And the state, in all of their court documents, which are very interesting to read, like they specifically reference Casey's support for the Palestinian resistance and how smart and educated and prolific they are, like in their writing and in their political thinking, as to what a danger they are to inspiring other people. And the precedent for like this kind of arson cases in the US, like Casey, I think, caused $96,000 in damage total. I think that's even less than what my comrades and I caused at Elbit with like paint and broken doors, which obviously Elbit was like exaggerating the amount of damages. But like that goes to say the precedent for these kind of arson cases, for example, people who burned a cop car in 2020 or threw Molotov in 2020, most people got 1 to 5 years. Casey got 19 years. And then like 15 years after their release, they will be closely monitored. They will not be able to like own electronic devices or do electronic communications without direct supervision. And again, this is because of the Palestine connection. And if you're gonna get 20 years for like burning a cop car, why would you stop at burning a cop car? Like that's the precedent that this sets, and that is the message that this is sending to the movement. And again, Casey was so abandoned by the movement. Like everyone was silent, almost everyone was silent when they were arrested and throughout their entire case. When they were sentenced, we saw a lot of people crying tears and suddenly becoming aware of their case, but we can't disconnect how bad their sentence is from that lack of support. If there had been mass support from the above ground movement, from all these organizations for Casey when they were arrested, I don't think their outcome would have been the same at all. And it's not like we're asking these NGOs to go burn cop cars or do direct actions themselves. Like, that would be ridiculous. But what they can do is provide political support for our prisoners instead of being totally silent and throwing them under the bus. Like, how can National Students for Justice in Palestine not say a single word about the only political prisoner of the student intifada for this entire time? Like, it's absurd to me. And Casey also joined T-HOSHA's hunger strike in the UK right before their sentencing. Like, right before they were about to get hit with their sentence, which is a huge risk. They're also type 1 diabetic. So, like, not eating is a huge risk to their health. And they're being deprived of their insulin right now as they're in all these federal holding facilities. And their experience just sounds like absolutely horrific. But Casey put out this amazing statement saying, you know, solidarity is action, it's not words. And that's why I'm putting my body on the line with T-HOSHA, who's one of the Filton 24, who's been indefinitely detained under the Terrorism Act in the UK. And the Filton 24 and some other prisoners are about to go on hunger strike again. And it'll be the biggest collective hunger strike in the UK since the 1981 Irish Republican hunger strikes in occupied north of Ireland. So it's going to be really historic. And I really wonder if more international prisoners are going to join this time around. But yeah, what I'm speaking about though is that there are people who take acts of resistance and who are abandoned by the movement in the West. And like, we do hear people say a lot, like, why is no one doing anything? Why is no one doing anything in the West? And like, I say that too because people aren't doing enough, but like, we also need to talk about the fact that people have done things and they're abandoned for doing them. And what message does that send to other people who want to resist if they know that they're not going to get any political support at all and people are just going to let them rot away in prison? Like, we cannot accept that, and we can't accept these sentences as inevitable. Like, we need to believe that we can actually free our prisoners.
I can carry on with this discussion, but I want to talk about one more political prisoner, Liqa Kurdiya. Tell us her story.
Yeah, Liqa Kurdiya is the only remaining student or detainee from like the student protests from that big wave of ICE deportations and detainments, starting with Mahmoud Khalil. And she was a Palestinian immigrant in New Jersey, and she participated in protests outside of Colombia, was arrested, and has been detained in Prairie Land in an ICE facility outside of Dallas-Fort Worth ever since. And they're also using against her, years of transactions of her sending money to her family in Gaza. And this is a huge aspect of all the repression coming down right now, is like they're targeting funding, they're targeting sending money. This is what they've always done from going back to the Holy Land 5 of saying that sending money to people in Gaza is like funding terrorist organizations. Anyways, she's still locked up, and now there's like much more of a wider campaign around her release. But something I think is really notable is that this ICE facility that she's being held in, the Prairie Land ICE facility, which is way overpopulated. It's holding way more detainees than it's supposed to. They're experiencing horrific abuses. On July 4th, there was a demonstration outside of this facility by a number of people who lit off fireworks, did like a noise demonstration in solidarity with the detainees inside. And it's very unclear what actually happened. Like, what I'm saying is based off of their support committee's narrative, like the state's narrative. Like, there's a lot of inconsistencies in the state's narrative, but basically they say that after this noise demo, some people in the wood line by the facility, after the police were drawn there, allegedly started shooting at correctional officers and like a police officer that came and like minorly injured one of them. And this led to the arrest of like all the activists that were in this area on terrorism charges, on attempt to murder a federal agent. And they've been held ever since on millions and millions of dollars of bail. And since then, they've rounded up like 12 more people. I think it's the Prairie Land 19 at this point. I think another person might have been arrested like yesterday or the day before, if I'm not mistaken. They're rounding up people who've never even been to this town, Alvarado, Texas, where the facility is, but people who are friends with these people, people who they're saying like, corrupted evidence after the arrest, people in the support committee, partners, roommates. It's really horrific. Only one of them has been out on bail. They did like an extensive manhunt for one person. And I bring up this case because Trump's designation of Antifa as a terrorist organization, the timeline of it like directly lines up with this case, with their indictments. And the first indictments for Antifa as a terrorist organization came down last week or the week before on 2 of the Prairie Land defendants, who they're saying were the leaders of an Antifa cell and that they were doing material support for terrorism, which is normally a law we see applied to like Palestinians. I mean, it was developed to target the Palestinian resistance and to target the diaspora's support for the resistance, but now we're seeing it applied in a domestic context. And I mean, obviously everyone knows like Antifa is not a real thing. It's not a real entity.
Yeah,
it's crazy. It's ridiculous, but it's this like umbrella term for any and all anti-fascist resistance. And it reminds me a lot of what we saw in Atlanta with the Cop City cases, which so many more people should have been paying attention to because it was a prediction of everything that has happened ever since then. For people who don't know, you know, like 60 people were rounded up at random, charged with racketeering, RICO, and domestic terrorism. Many people who did not know each other, who just like showed up to a music festival and were rounded up and arrested and said that they were all part of the same criminal entity, the Defend the Atlanta Forest movement, based on having signed a petition, on having been to an event, on having like sent a Venmo transaction for like gas or something. And they, I think, are gonna try to do like something similar with using Antifa as this umbrella term with these sweeping like racketeering or federal conspiracy cases. And thankfully, a lot of the Atlanta charges have been dropped. There's one person there who's Jack Mazurek, who's like the only person who's been charged for like clandestine arson and direct action there. And hopefully like his charges also get dropped since the evidence against him is bullshit. But people really need to be paying attention to what the enemy is saying and doing right now. After the Antifa designation, because it was so vague and because there's no actual legal mechanism to designate domestic terrorist groups, like there's no list of foreign terrorist, or there's a list of foreign terrorist organizations. There's no such equivalent for domestic terrorist organizations. And it's not the same how it works in the UK with like this prescription list that includes both. And so Trump like wrote this whole memorandum about how he's gonna take down, dismantle the entire opposition, the entire left, especially targeting funding networks, NGOs, portraying all domestic protests as like driven by foreign influence. And I think it's important to emphasize too, like the laws haven't actually changed. And a lot of this was set up by Biden. The joint terrorism task forces that were setting up all the precedent for this were started by Biden and the Democrats. And Trump is simply continuing that agenda and that work. But a lot of this is also just gonna be used to target like liberal NGOs that I don't see as threatening and that I see as counterinsurgent and like part of the enemy, but that Trump still sees as this enemy and wants to take down. But certainly it will be used against like militants and anti-imperialists as well. And we need to study what the enemy is doing and saying. And we need to anticipate like this level of repression and how to combat it. And yeah, the Prairie Land defendants need to be freed. Unfortunately, there's people in that case who are collaborating with the state, which is really dangerous and really bad. They've been like totally deprived of due process and like fair legal representation. But compared to like when I was first charged, there is such like a larger number of political prisoners and people facing repression now. And that is where like the heart of the resistance is going to be, and doing that support work and connecting with those prisoners and rallying around their freedom is what I see as like some of the most important work to do in the West right now.
With all this discussion about all these political prisoners, huge numbers that we haven't seen in decades like this in the United States, we also just said our farewells to one of the most famous political prisoners in the United States, Assata Shakur, and she was, of course, freed by her comrades in an action. And we know in Palestine how important prisoners are to the struggle. Palestinians talk about our prisoners as living martyrs that are giving their life as they are imprisoned. And many of the leaders of the resistance actually formulated their thought and their ideas, including Martyr Sinwar, inside these jails. And of course, there's been many jailbreaks by Palestinian prisoners, the latest of being the tunnel, the Jerboa tunnel prisoners. One of them just got released a few days ago in the prisoner exchange. How do you see this historical record of support for prisoners, breakout of prisoners, and the political education that happens in prison. Do you see possibilities of, since we are kind of on the same trajectory as happened in the 60s and 70s in the United States, do you see that we may get to that militancy of trying to break people out of jail? Is that something that we should be hoping for?
Absolutely. If we're not, then what are we even fighting for? I think a lot of the power of the state and the repressive regime lies in their psychological prestige in this like omnipotent power that we apply to them that is not really true at all. And like the al-Aqsa flood just shattered that. It shattered it completely. Like we need to believe that prison breaks are possible. We need to believe that the freedom of our comrades is possible, and that the prison is simply a different battlefield, a different terrain to be struggling on. George Abdullah, who was just freed, has given so many amazing interviews since his release where he's really emphasized this, that, you know, as a fighter, he just simply had to become a fighter in different conditions in a new context inside prison, and that it was not the conscience of the French or US government that freed him. It was that the movement on the outside was so strong that he was a greater threat inside prison than he was on the outside. And he credits that for his freedom. I think, you know, we have so much to learn from the Palestinian prisoners movement. Like the al-Aqsa flood was a prison break in itself, breaking out of the open air prison that is Gaza, but it was also fought for the liberation of prisoners, which it has won. And it was planned and executed by freed prisoners who were freed through resistance operations of other people who ended up in prison. Like it's this constant spiral and dialectical process where liberation might not come in their lifetimes or our lifetimes, but every step of resistance, every contribution, like, is getting us closer to that. And Asada's example is really important. You know, like I came here for the commemoration of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah's martyrdom, and Asada, the news of her passing was announced like a couple days before that, and so I was thinking so much of her example and how important she is to like the revolutionary movement in the US as I was attending those ceremonies, and how few leaders we have in the US to like look at as resistance leaders, but she is one of them. And she was freed because of her comrades. And people don't know about the people who ended up in prison for the rest of their lives, like Mutulu Shakur and Sekou Odinga and Marilyn Buck, because they participated in her freedom operation and that sacrifice they made so that she could be free. And of course, when I speak about all these new political prisoners in the US, like that's not to write off the fact that there's many prisoners of the Black Liberation Army and other resistance struggles that have been locked up for decades and decades and decades, that also need to be freed, and their freedom needs to be fought for. But yeah, if Palestinian prisoners can dig tunnels with spoons and break out of Zionist dungeons, then prison breaks are absolutely possible and tangible anywhere in the world. And like we need to dismantle this idea of powerlessness that we have in our own heads in order to actually like take up resistance.
Definitely those images of breaking out from the Gilboa prison shook the world. It also inspired people and gave them hope. And the prison break on October 7th shook the world even further. Much of the imagination now is lit up in peoples that are resisting imperialism and colonialism and capitalism around the world. We never got to talk about your experience inside the jail.
Yeah.
How much interaction you had with the other prisoners? How was that exchange? You know, is there camaraderie moments in that prison?
Absolutely. I mean, we knew everyone in the jail. Like, it was a very small facility, especially the women's units. There were only 2 women's units, and like New Hampshire's a small state. So it's the biggest county jail in New Hampshire that we were in. It was in Manchester, New Hampshire. It's called Valley Street Jail. And I mean, ultimately the experience in there, like, we just felt really lucky and grateful because we'd been facing 37 years in prison, and for a while we didn't know how long we were going to get. And like the first offers we were getting in our plea negotiations were like 1 to 2 years. So we were anticipating a lot longer. And then being able to go in and know like exactly when we were going in and going out, that's not the case for most prisoners at all. And also the level of outside support we had, people sending us letters, people sending money to our commissary, We were able to like share that with other prisoners inside. And yeah, I mean, we were friends with everyone. Like everyone knew why we were in there because everyone else knew each other from the streets. Everyone else was in there for like street crime and lumpen related crime and like drug things, like most jails in the US.
Poverty crimes.
Yeah, exactly. And so they wanted to know who we were and why we were in there. And when we explained them, many people like had never even heard of Palestine before, and they were supportive because they're mothers. And they said, okay, you're trying to dismantle weapons factories that are killing children. Like, of course we relate to that. And they were like, yeah, next time, like, invite us to do a direct action at Elbit. Like, that sounds awesome. We were getting books inside, and like we were doing informal political education. People were reading the books we were receiving about Palestine, about struggle. Like, our best friend inside was pregnant, who we shared a cell with, and like we got to mail her Assada's autobiography because Assada, of course, famously was pregnant and gave birth when she was in prison. I mean, the prison experience is so different in the US than it is in Zionist dungeons. I mean, we had more rights in a lot of ways. Like, we had a lot of eyes on us, so they couldn't like abuse us in the same ways that they can to other prisoners in the US or like in Palestine, because they knew people were watching and that we had a lot of outside support and like media attention on us. And you know, prisons like in the US aren't universities and temples in the same way that they are in Palestine, simply because of like the mass national unity and anti-imperialist consciousness that exists in Palestine. Certainly there have been like attempts to build that, and like there have been incredible moments of like prison uprising and organizing, whether it's Attica, whether it's what George Jackson was attempting with the Black guerrilla family in California prisons, which reminds me a lot of, you know, what we've read about the unification of like the Palestinian leadership in prisons and their, you know, establishment of structure and organization to, you know, enact security measures against collaborators, to institute education, to negotiate with the occupation on releases. George Jackson was really like attempting similar structures with Black prisoners and all prisoners who were anti-imperialist and pro-resistance. And he was martyred because of that.
That's why they killed him, definitely.
Exactly. But you know, sometimes we hear this like axiom that like all prisoners are political prisoners, and that's something I've even said at times, but like it's something I've come to push back against because I think it's reductive. Like, we can recognize that all incarceration is political. Everyone is in prison for like a political reason, but that doesn't make them a political prisoner. And there's even people in prison who are in prison for political acts who may not really be politicized or be considering themselves as political prisoners or be moving as political prisoners. And I mean, prison is like a microcosm of US society, which is incredibly reactionary. And so not every prisoner is a political prisoner, but I do think prisons are like one of the most important sites of struggle and organizing, and we will only see that blossom and grow as more people get locked up, unfortunately, and that becomes their site of organizing. We got a lot of letters and outside support when we were inside, and like I will say, it was kind of like this sudden rush of support once we were sentenced and could be portrayed as like martyrs, and people could hold events in our name that we didn't have when we were actually facing the heavy charges and when we were first locked up. And like that felt strange to us. And we'd be inside and we'd be receiving all these letters of people being like, thank you for your sacrifices. Like, we'll never forget you, as if we were dead. And we're like, we're getting out in like 2 weeks. And so we'd communicate to people on the outside, to our support committee, and we were like, can you please get people to like do direct actions against Elbit instead? Or can you use these events to organize people around like learning security measures and like direct action skills? Or can you write to people like Casey and Mumia and the Virgin Island 3, like people who are locked up for much longer, who aren't getting this level of support that we have? We got to exchange messages with like a PAL Action UK prisoner who was locked up at the same time, Francesca Nadine, who's now released and is helping spearhead this hunger strike from the outside with Prisoners for Palestine in the UK. Mumia sent us a message over a recorded phone call, which was just like an incredible gesture of solidarity to receive from someone who's been locked up for that long. But yeah, it was really a transformative experience. Like, being in jail for 40 days is not that crazy for like the average person in the US, especially a poor person. But what was unique was the reasons we were in there for it and our like petty bourgeois backgrounds. Like, I was the first person in my family to go to jail, my immediate family. And so it was radicalizing for like everyone around me and everyone who knew me, and my parents for experiencing that level of repression so directly. And now we're out on a suspended sentence. So like, if I'm in the US and I get arrested for anything, if I make contact with any Elbit employee or facility, if I even tag them on social media, I could automatically go to prison for 2 years. And of course, the level of repression has never ended. Like the FBI was involved. I mean, the feds were watching us like from day one with PAL Action US, but they like publicly declared their involvement in the investigation in Merrimack, New Hampshire. The day we were arrested, the feds seized my phone. The feds tried to pressure me to give information on other people. And that federal investigations don't just end. Like they will carry those on until they decide to come down on you one day. And so obviously I've continued to experience a lot of repression as I've like been entering and leaving the country, detainment, device seizures, interrogations, etc., which is also normal for a lot of people who do this kind of work and who openly support the resistance. And ultimately, like that's what we signed up for. Like I feel like a lot of people have a martyr complex about even getting put on Canary mission, when really, like, if we want to build a resistance, if we want to overthrow the system, repression is an inherent part of that. And it's about how we can wield repression to turn it against the state and to use it to build our movement even stronger.
I'm glad you mentioned, obviously, Mumia Abu Jamal. There's Leonard Peltier, who just got released.
But is still on house arrest and
yes.
Can't talk to his comrades and is barely free.
Yes, yeah. And the viewers need to learn more about the history of prisoner struggles in the United States. Even Malcolm X was educated politically during his time in jail. And the Attica uprising in New York, I had a very close friend, comrade, that was part of the Attica uprising, indigenous Mohawk, Iroquois Canadian, quote unquote Canadian, splitting the sky. He was one of the people that survived the Attica uprising, and I joined them in their struggle at the Gustafson Lake standoff in British Columbia. It is very, very important that we not forget those who have sacrificed for our freedoms behind the jail walls. Calla, one more question, because we're taking a lot of your time here. There's upcoming actions to stand in solidarity with those who are jailed. Tell us about them.
Yeah, so I already kind of briefly mentioned this, but the Filton 24 and the Bryce Norton 5 have been detained indefinitely without bail in dungeons in the so-called United Kingdom for taking part in direct action against Zionist weapons manufacturers, and in the case of the Bryce Norton 5, for breaking into a UK Air Force base allegedly and damaging an Air Force jet. And they are being held under the Terrorism Act. And they have reached a point where they've experienced so much discrimination, so much abuse, so much targeting, whether it's isolation from other prisoners, that they don't want them to be organizing and politicizing, censorship of their mail-in communications, like hindering of their right to a fair trial, deprivation of religious services and Quran, and call to prayer of different prisoners, that they have exhausted all mechanisms of appealing to the government and to the prison authorities, and dozens of them are ready to put their bodies on the line if the UK government does not meet their demands, which I don't think the UK government has the moral conscience to meet their demands. And so I do think this strike is going to start. It's set to start on the 2nd of November, the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, which granted British support officially to Zionist settler colonialism in Palestine. And it's really smart how they're, giving this time in advance to build momentum around the strike, to spread the word about it, maybe to get prisoners internationally to join, how we saw with the last one when Casey and Malik Muhammad joined. And so folks should follow Prisoners for Palestine. That is the main group that is negotiating with Cage International, with the British government, on behalf of these prisoners. Like I said, it's going to be historic in terms of the size of the collective hunger strike. And this is a tactic that's so important to liberation movements, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Ireland, whether it's in the US or India or South Africa. And so folks should certainly stay updated on the calls to action. I'm sure they'll be putting out information on like calling the prison authorities, calling the US government or the UK government to build pressure on these demands. But the last hunger strike, Taoiseach was going for like 2 weeks before it really built momentum, before I even heard about it. And I like consider myself someone who follows these things pretty closely. So we need to refuse that same tendency of abandonment and silence. We need to be as loud as possible and do whatever we can to uplift this struggle and to free these prisoners. And you know, some people like push back against hunger strikes. They say it's futile, they say it's suicidal, they say it's self-harm. And I really think like a hunger strike is, it's the opposite of suicidal. It is a reassertion of life in itself. It's when your body is your only weapon left, and that's what you put on the line. And it really stands in stark contrast to these performative like 3-day hunger strikes that we've seen people like Zahran Mamdani do, or like JVP do, like 1-day fast hunger strikes for Gaza, as if you can even call that a hunger strike. It makes a mockery, an offensive mockery of a tactic that many resistance fighters have been martyred through. And so this is like the compass of our movement. This is what we need to be upholding, and not just with solidarity statements, but with actions. Like we need to be surrounding these prisons. We need to be letting the walls crumble down, and we need to spread the word to as many prisoners as possible if folks want to choose to participate themselves, however they can. I think it's going to be really big, and have so much respect for the movement in the UK, and also just how unified they are around their prisoners. Like in the US, we kind of see a lot of individual support campaigns, but the families there are really unified and are doing weekly mobilizations outside of the prisons. And we'll see what happens.
Well, obviously, Bobby Sands is an inspiration from our Irish siblings. And you are Irish American. Calla Walsh, thank you very much for giving us this time. We wish you the best of luck on whatever activities you follow on through again. People should follow you on Twitter and definitely should get involved in the support of the Prairie Land 19 and others that are going to go on hunger strike. We saw how the Palestinian prisoners that went on hunger strike before al-Aqsa flood, how much attention that gave to their cause, and Bobby Sands definitely raised the portfolio of Irish political prisoners in the United Kingdom. Thank you one more time, Calla Walsh. See you soon. You're still watching Wartime Cafe, and I'm your host, Laith Marouf. Behind the camera is Rabih Ghannam this time, not Hadi Htait. Go to our website, freepalestine.video, to donate so we can continue producing this content for you, and press the subscribe button on whatever social media platform you're watching this on. And until we see you next time, I bid you all a free Palestine and a free Lebanon.